August 19, 1943, 2:45 a.m., in the cold, silent darkness beneath the Harz Mountains of central Germany, the earth trembled faintly as ventilation fans groaned to life deep inside a cavernous tunnel system that few civilians even knew existed, and as the first flicker of electric lamps sputtered along the damp stone walls, thousands of prisoners, thin, shivering silhouettes stripped of identity and hope, were marched into the bowels of what would soon become the most secret weapons factory in the Third Reich. Outside, the moon hovered low over the mist-covered forests near Nordhausen, illuminating nothing of the horror hidden beneath the mountain's skin. Guards with rifles slung across their shoulders paced the entrances, stamping their boots against the chill, glancing occasionally at the massive steel doors that sealed off the tunnels night and day. To the forest above, the mountain was stone and soil. To the world, it was just another quiet stretch of German countryside. But below ground, behind those doors, Germany was constructing the weapon Hitler believed would reverse the war, the V-2 rocket. The prisoners taken from Buchenwald, engineers, carpenters, welders, miners, clerks, anyone whose hands might be useful, entered the tunnels in long, staggering lines. Their breath formed pale clouds in the icy cavern air as they descended ramps carved into stone. Inside, the tunnels smelled of dust, oil, and sweat, a scent that clung to everything. Electric bulbs dangled from overhead wires, barely piercing the gloom. The walls were raw rock, rough and sweating moisture, a reminder that the mountain itself was both shelter and prison. And, though none could yet grasp it, this underground warren, soon named Mittelwerk, would become the birthplace of the world's first long-range ballistic missile. The idea for an underground factory had begun earlier that year when Allied bombers devastated Germany's surface rocket facilities. Entire production halls destroyed in minutes. Blueprints scattered. Scientists shaken. The Luftwaffe powerless to stop the raids. Hitler's rage was volcanic. "Never again," he declared, "will a single enemy bomb fall on my miracle weapons." So his commanders offered a solution. Bury the weapon. Build the rockets in darkness. Hide them deeper than any bomb could reach. And thus the Harz Mountains, ancient, silent, and sprawling, were chosen as the new cradle for Germany's final hope. By late summer, the mountain echoed with the sound of forced labor. Prisoners hacked at stone for 12, 14, 16 hours at a time. The tunnels stretched for miles, twin main galleries, each long enough to swallow a train, connected by branching corridors like veins. Floodlights glared on cavern ceilings. Jackhammers shrieked. Dust filled the air, choking lungs already weakened by starvation. Each day, the line of survivors grew shorter. Those who collapsed were carried away, never to return. For the SS, deaths were a statistic, a trivial cost of production. For the laborers, each sunrise was a surprise. Yet deeper in the mountain, behind locked doors, another world unfolded, one of precision and ambition. German engineers in crisp uniforms inspected blueprints under bright lamps. Technicians calibrated instruments. Crates of specialized components arrived by rail at the tunnel entrances, hauled inside by exhausted prisoners forced to carry the same boxes that contained the parts for their own suffering. Amid the chaos, Wernher von Braun, the visionary behind Germany's rocket program, walked through the galleries with a measuring rod in hand, examining clearances where future assembly lines would run. His mind lived in calculations, distances, weights, trajectories. He saw the mountain not as a tomb but as a temple to the future of flight. Yet even he could not ignore the gaunt faces staring at him as he passed. Some whispered prayers. Others glared with hollow hatred. Von Braun kept walking. Above ground, the war was beginning to shift. The Allies advanced through Italy. The Eastern Front demanded more German divisions each month. Fuel shortages worsened. Factories strained. Yet amid the chaos, Hitler clung more tightly to the V-2. His Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapon he believed would turn the tide. Goebbels fed the fantasy with propaganda speeches describing rockets as unstoppable as thunderstorms, capable of smashing London into submission. Even as German cities burned beneath nightly bombing raids, the regime poured resources into Mittelwerk. Steel, machinery, chemicals, engineers, all diverted toward a single purpose: create a weapon that would force Britain out of the war. Back underground, the first assembly stations took shape. Prisoners stacked crates, unrolled cables, mounted metal hulls onto jigs. The V2, 46 feet tall when complete, required hundreds of intricate parts: fuel pumps, guidance gyroscopes, combustion chambers capable of withstanding infernos hotter than a furnace flame. Each piece arrived in boxes labeled with cryptic codes. The prisoners never saw the finished weapon standing upright. They only saw fragments: steel tubes, conical nozzles, wiring looms that hinted at its terrible potential. Some workers whispered that they were building aircraft. Others believed it was a new type of submarine weapon. Only a few understood the truth, and those who spoke it risked being shot on the spot. Every day, the tunnels grew more alive. Steam pipes rattled. Cranes groaned. Sparks flashed from welding torches. The mountain rumbled with industrial energy. Yet the human cost deepened. The camp attached to Mittelwerk-Dora, later known as Mittelbau-Dora, became a place of unimaginable suffering. Prisoners slept without mattresses in freezing barracks carved from the tunnels themselves. Death from exhaustion, disease, beatings, and starvation was constant. Survivors later described it as a world without daylight, a nightmare where time lost meaning. For the SS, fear was an efficient fuel, and the mountain devoured the men forced to feed it. Still, production accelerated. Germany rushed toward what it believed would be salvation, and in the autumn of 1943, the first nearly complete V2 hull lay on its side along the assembly rail, sleek, metallic, and monstrous. Engineers walked around it like priests inspecting a sacred relic. Prisoners eyed it with dread. Few understood its significance, but all sensed its danger. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Above them, winter winds swept across Nordhausen. Trains arrived at night, their whistles muffled by snow. Trucks carrying fuel tanks and delicate valves wound through the forest roads. And always the guards watched, pacing along the perimeter, knowing the mountain held a secret capable of changing the war. Even Allied intelligence had only fragments: rumors of a long-range artillery rocket, sightings of unusual research activity, vague reports from resistance movements. But none yet imagined the scale of the underground factory. By December, the first test components shipped out. The V2 still required final calibration above ground, but Mittelwerk had become the heart of production. Rockets rolled out on rail wagons pulled by slaves, then carefully transported to testing grounds under cover of darkness. Some prisoners caught glimpses of them leaving, sleek, predatory shapes cloaked under tarps, guarded by SS escorts. Those who watched felt a cold certainty: whatever the mountain birthed was built for killing. Meanwhile, in Berlin, Hitler demanded results. "London must burn," he declared during a winter briefing. "Make the British tremble." His generals exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the V2 was a technological marvel, but also temperamental, expensive, and difficult to produce in large numbers. Yet no one dared challenge the order. Instead, they increased pressure on Mittelwerk. Faster, more rockets, more output. And so the mountain tightened its grip on those trapped inside. Steam pipes burst in the cold. Machinery jammed. Accidents claimed fingers, limbs, lives. The tunnels filled with the metallic scent of blood more frequently than diesel or welding fumes. But the work continued. It had to. The Reich demanded miracles, and every prisoner knew that failure meant death, not only for them but for those working beside them. Above the mountain, Allied reconnaissance planes occasionally swept across the sky, searching for signs of German rocket activity. They saw almost nothing: a cluster of barracks, a railway line, a few inconspicuous buildings. Nothing revealed the vast industrial machine hidden beneath the stone. Nothing hinted that Germany's most advanced weapon grew underground like a steel serpent waiting to strike. Then came the moment the mountain had been preparing for. The first V2s left Mittelwerk completed and ready for deployment. Trucks rumbled out under night cover. SS officers saluted. Engineers nodded with grim satisfaction. Prisoners watched with hollow eyes. And thousands of miles away, in a city that had endured years of bombing, life went on unaware that history's first ballistic missiles were about to enter the war. In the tunnels, the work did not slow. More rockets, more labor, more suffering. The mountain demanded everything, and it was only just beginning. September 8, 1944, 6:43 p.m., as London commuters stepped off trams beneath a grey evening sky and mothers called their children home from the fading daylight, a single streak of white vapour carved across the upper atmosphere, silent, thin, almost delicate, yet carrying within it the explosive force of an entire artillery battery, and in the next instant, without warning, without the howl of sirens, without even the whistle of dissent, the first V2 rocket ever fired in anger slammed into Staveley Road with a blast that shattered windows for miles. There was no roar until the moment of impact, no hint that the missile had fallen from a suborbital arc at 3 times the speed of sound, no possibility of interception. Londoners, accustomed to the rising and falling moan of air raid sirens and the droning engines of incoming bombers, found themselves struck by a weapon that offered no warning at all. Dust rose in choking clouds. Brick houses collapsed like sand sculptures. A crater opened in the street wide enough to swallow a truck. For seconds, people stood frozen, unsure whether the explosion had come from above or below, unable to understand that the age of ballistic warfare had begun without fanfare or declaration. In Berlin, news of the successful launch sent ripples of triumph through the high command. Hitler, upon hearing confirmation, allegedly straightened in his chair, eyes bright for the first time in months, declaring the weapon a signal of fate, the instrument that would finally punish the British for their defiance. Propaganda broadcasts immediately seized the moment, boasting that retribution had arrived in the form of a weapon beyond Allied comprehension. Posters depicted rockets streaking across the sky like avenging spirits. Speakers claimed that terror itself now served Germany. But inside the mountain where the rockets were built, the reaction was far more complex. The prisoners of Mittelwerk heard rumors trickle through the tunnels, whispers that the weapons they assembled in agony were now falling on London. Some felt a grim satisfaction that the war might end sooner if Germany exhausted its resources. Others felt horror that their forced labor now killed civilians thousands of miles away. Yet regardless of emotion, the production tempo increased dramatically. SS officers barked orders to double the output. Engineers worked longer hours beneath buzzing lamps. Ventilation systems strained to clear the dust kicked up by constant drilling and machining. Every sound echoed through the stone. Hammer blows, engine hums, the guttural shouts of guards, until the mountain felt alive with mechanical heartbeat. Day and night blurred together. Prisoners marched into the tunnels before dawn and returned long after dusk, their bodies wearing thin as they carried heavy rocket components through the galleries. Men forced to install wiring harnesses developed burns from soldering irons. Those who mixed fuel compounds lost consciousness from fumes. Those who failed to meet quotas vanished. And yet, despite the brutality of the system, Mittelwerk continued producing rockets with astonishing speed. Trainloads of steel arrived. Gyroscope sets were delivered from scattered factories across the Reich. Propellant tanks were polished and inspected. The mountain's interior, once rough stone, now resembled a subterranean industrial city, pipes snaking along ceilings, cranes gliding on rails, assembly lines illuminated by long rows of harsh white bulbs. As autumn deepened, V-2 rockets launched not only from Holland toward London, but from German positions near the Rhine targeting Antwerp, the lifeline of Allied supplies pouring into Europe. Each missile represented months of suffering underground and seconds of terror above ground. Civilians learned to live with the horrible unpredictability of the weapon. A quiet street could vanish in an instant. A market filled with morning shoppers could be reduced to rubble without a sound of approach. Newspapers called it the ghost weapon, a phrase that captured its invisibility, its arbitrary cruelty. The British government, aware that panic could cripple morale, initially suppressed details of the new threat, attributing explosions to gas mains. But as the attacks increased, the truth became impossible to cloak. Churchill addressed Parliament with grave resolve, promising retaliation and vowing that Britain would endure as it had endured every assault to that point. While London faced the terror of the unknown, Allied intelligence accelerated its efforts to understand the V-2 program. Reconnaissance flights mapped launch sites across occupied Europe, identifying mobile platforms that made targeting difficult. Resistance networks in Holland risked their lives to report launch coordinates to British operatives, often transmitting information as rockets were being fueled. Scientists at the British Ministry of Supply analyzed debris, calculating thrust, fuel composition, and trajectory. Each recovered fragment became a clue to the weapon's origin. Eventually, reports pointed consistently toward the Harz Mountains, where an abnormal increase in rail traffic and construction had been observed. Still, no one imagined the scale of Mittelwerk, kilometers of tunnels carved into ancient rock, swallowing trains whole, hiding an industrial complex larger than many surface factories. Meanwhile, inside the mountain, tension mounted as accidents increased. The V-2's fuel and oxidizer, liquid oxygen and alcohol, were volatile. A single spark, a single misaligned valve, could turn an entire section of tunnel into an inferno. One afternoon, as winter storms raged outside, a pressurized tank ruptured in Gallery 41. The blast hurled metal fragments across the assembly bay, killing several prisoners instantly and injuring dozens more. This sealed off the area, removed the bodies, and forced the surviving laborers back to work. To the prisoners, the mountain felt not only like a place of suffering, but a being that demanded sacrifice. As Germany's military situation deteriorated on all fronts, Mittelwerk became more frantic. The Eastern Front collapsed day by day under Soviet pressure. Allied forces pushed through France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Bombers pounded German factories with relentless precision. But the mountain remained untouched, safe beneath meters of stone, its secret intact. Rocket launches continued. London heard the blasts. Antwerp burned. Hitler grew increasingly obsessed with the V-2, arguing that if thousands could be produced, the Allies might be forced to negotiate. His generals knew better. They knew the weapon was technologically impressive, but strategically insufficient. It killed civilians, destroyed homes, created fear, yet it could not turn the tide of the war. It could not stop the Red Army. It could not halt American armor. It could not supply German forces or preserve shrinking territory. It was, at best, a gesture of defiance wrapped in scientific marvel. But no one dared to tell him this directly. Still, for the engineers working underground, every launch felt like a validation of their work. Technicians checked readouts, calibrated components, and watched trains carry away the fruits of their labor. Yet even among them, unease grew. The conditions were degrading rapidly. Equipment shortages increased. Replacement parts arrived late or improperly machined. Skilled workers were conscripted. and the moral weight of using forced labor gnawed at some, though they rarely expressed it aloud. The mountain, once a symbol of innovation, now felt like a fortress of despair. Outside, Allied bombers intensified attacks on transportation routes feeding Mittelwerk. Bridges collapsed. Rail lines twisted under high explosives. Supply shipments slowed. Some engineers feared that the mountain would soon be isolated. Meanwhile, the SS tightened security, suspecting sabotage. Prisoners caught damaging components, even accidentally, were executed publicly. Their deaths meant to terrify others into obedience. Yet small acts of resistance persisted. A loosened bolt, a hidden crack, a miswired connection. Tiny flaws planted in moments of risk, each carrying the potential to cause catastrophic failure during launch. It was the only way the prisoners could fight back. By early 1945, the V2 campaign reached its peak, even as Germany's defeat approached. The skies over London glowed with fires from detonations. Antwerp's docks suffered repeated strikes. Civilians lived with the constant dread of invisible death descending from the upper atmosphere. But the Allies were closing in. The Rhine River defenses collapsed. American armored columns swept eastward. The Soviets stormed across Poland and into Germany itself. And as the noose tightened, the secret buried beneath the Harz Mountains began to unravel. One icy February night, trains stopped reaching Mittelwerk. Rumors spread that Allied bombing had severed the valley's rail connection. Engineers argued in panicked tones. Guards shouted louder than usual. For the first time, the mountain felt fragile, not because of bombs from above, but because the war outside was slipping beyond Germany's control. The prisoners sensed it too. They marched into the tunnels with renewed, desperate hope, whispering that liberation might come before the SS destroyed the evidence of their crimes. Then, on a bitter morning in March, with snow drifting across the forest outside, the orders arrived. All remaining rockets must be completed as quickly as possible. Anything unfinished would be destroyed. Valuable documents would be burned. The mountain was no longer a fortress of production. It had become a vault of secrets the Allies must never uncover. Yet the Allies were closer than the engineers feared. American reconnaissance aircraft photographed rail yards near Nordhausen showing abnormal damage and abandoned trains. Intercepted German communications indicated unusual activity near the mountain, and captured documents revealed references to something called Dora Mittelbau, a name unknown to Allied analysts but ominous in its frequency. Inside the tunnels, the last weeks were marked by desperation. Rockets were assembled with whatever parts remained. Some were loaded onto trucks under the cover of night. Others remained unfinished in the galleries, surrounded by scattered tools and abandoned manuals. The SS grew increasingly violent, knowing their authority was slipping. Prisoners endured beatings, starvation, and exhaustion as they waited for the front lines to reach them. And above ground, as April approached, the rumble of artillery grew louder in the distance. The war was coming to the mountain. And when it arrived, the Allies would uncover a secret that shocked even the most battle-hardened soldiers, a secret carved in stone, built with genius, powered by suffering, and hidden in darkness for far too long. April 2, 1945, 7:15 a.m., as the first dim rays of spring sunlight filtered weakly through a veil of mist settling over the Harz Mountains, the trembling ground carried a distant rumble that the prisoners of Mittelwerk felt through their boots long before they heard it, a low thunder that rolled through the stone ribs of the mountain like an omen announcing that the war outside was shifting toward them. Deep in the tunnels, men paused in their labor, exchanging wary glances while SS guards snapped at them to continue assembling rocket components, pretending not to notice the creeping sound of artillery advancing from the west. For months the mountain had been insulated from the war's destruction. No bombs could reach it, no reconnaissance could see through the rock, no enemy could strike what they could not find. But now the world beyond the tunnels was finally closing in, and the illusion of safety that surrounded the underground factory began to fracture. Engineers huddled over blueprints, their hands shaking as they discussed the imminent danger. Rumors swirled through the galleries. The Americans had broken through the last defensive lines. The Soviets were pushing from the east. The air above the Harz was filled with Allied aircraft searching for anything left worth bombing. The SS, aware that their own fates were tied to the secrecy of Mittelwerk, grew increasingly nervous and violent, shouting louder, punishing faster, and clutching their weapons with white-knuckled tension. Outside, the valley roads crackled with retreating Wehrmacht vehicles dragging mud behind them, engines sputtering, their crews exhausted and demoralized, bearing the look of men who had abandoned hope. Some of these retreating units passed near the mountain, and whispered to the guards at the entrances that American tanks had been spotted no more than 50 kilometers away. The SS responded by tightening the perimeter, ordering extra patrols, and preparing demolition charges that, if triggered, would collapse entire sections of the factory. Hitler's final orders were explicit. Nothing in Mittelwerk must fall into Allied hands intact. The engineers, horrified by this directive, knew that destroying the tunnels would bury thousands of prisoners alive and annihilate years of research. But the SS, their loyalty sustained by fanatic belief or fear of punishment, prepared the explosives nonetheless. Meanwhile, inside the dim, choking galleries of the factory, production continued with manic desperation. The V2 assembly lines, once meticulously maintained, now resembled chaotic scrapyards of scattered tools, broken crates, and misaligned components. The shortage of trained labor and materials grew catastrophic. Fuel tanks arrived dented, gyroscope sets arrived incomplete, and electrical systems were patched together with whatever wires could be scavenged. Yet the SS demanded rockets, finished rockets, insisting they could still be launched at Antwerp or London in a last gesture of defiance. Engineers protested that many of the components were useless, but their objections were met with threats. Prisoners, driven beyond human endurance, stumbled through the tunnels carrying heavy assemblies on their backs, coughing from dust and fumes, some collapsing from hunger. The air smelled of oil, metal shavings, and fear. But outside the mountain, the thunder grew louder. Allied aircraft swept over Nordhausen, the nearest town, in waves. On April 3rd and 4th, bombs rained down on the valley, obliterating train yards, factories, and barracks. Smoke rose in thick pillars visible even from deep underground, drifting into the tunnel entrances and mixing with the stale air. The prisoners instinctively understood what was happening. Liberation was approaching. The guards understood it too, and their panic intensified. Some officers fled. Others became more ruthless. The entire mountain seemed on the verge of unraveling. Then came the moment that marked the beginning of the end. On April 6th, American reconnaissance units approached Nordhausen, encountering little resistance. The German front line had collapsed under relentless pressure. Civilians fled through the forests. Wehrmacht soldiers discarded their uniforms to avoid capture, and as the Americans advanced, they were directed by liberated forced laborers toward a site the U.S. Army had never heard of, a camp called Dora, hidden among the hills. The approach to Dora stunned even hardened combat veterans. Wooden barracks sagged under their own weight. Emaciated prisoners wandered in confusion, some too weak to stand. Bodies lay unburied, victims of starvation, disease, and overwork. The soldiers who stumbled upon the camp froze at the sight, unable to comprehend the scale of suffering that had been tucked away in these forests. They radioed for medical teams, food supplies, ambulances, anything that could help. And as doctors and medics poured into the camp, the truth emerged from trembling lips and whispered testimonies. Dora was not the main horror. The real secret lay inside a mountain, a factory, a place where rockets were built and men died in the process, a place called Mittelwerk. American officers reached the tunnel entrance the next morning, cautiously approaching the concrete portals with weapons drawn. The air was thick with dust and exhaust drifting from the depths. They expected resistance, ambushes, traps, but instead found eerie silence. Abandoned tools littered the ground. A half-loaded cart sat on the tracks. Light bulbs hung from cables, still glowing faintly. The SS had fled hours before, leaving behind only their cruelty and their secrets. When the Americans stepped inside, their boots echoed through a vast, cavernous space unlike anything they had encountered in Europe. The deeper they went, the more staggering the scale became. Massive rocket fuselages stretched hundreds of feet along the galleries. Tunnels branched into engineering rooms, storage areas, machine shops, and living quarters for the guards. Cranes hung from reinforced ceilings. Pipes rattled with residual pressure. It was an entire subterranean world built for war, hidden, protected, and fueled by human suffering. The soldiers moved slowly, absorbing the enormity of the discovery. Some photographed the tunnels. Others ran their hands along the cold metal skin of unfinished rockets, marveling that such advanced technology had been born in a place so primitive and brutal. One officer, stunned by the size of the facilities, whispered, "This is the future, buried under the earth." But the prisoners who accompanied the Americans into the tunnels shook their heads. They knew the truth. Mittelwerk was not the future. It was a tomb of ambition and despair. They pointed out the places where men had died from exhaustion, where guards had beaten laborers, where sabotage had been attempted. They showed the Americans the bodies left inside chambers. And as the flashbulbs lit the darkness, the U.S. Army documented everything. Engineers, intelligence officers, and scientists arrived in waves, rushing into the mountain to assess what Germany had built. Among them were members of the U.S. technical teams assigned to evaluate enemy technology, teams that would later form the backbone of Operation Paperclip. They immediately recognized the significance of what lay before them. The V-2 rocket represented a leap in warfare so profound that it could redefine the coming era. Jet propulsion, ballistic trajectories, guidance systems, technologies decades ahead of what the Allies had imagined Germany could produce. The American officers realized they were standing inside a treasure trove of intelligence, one that must not fall into Soviet hands. While the U.S. surveyed the tunnels, Soviet forces pushed rapidly from the east, closing the distance with every hour. The race for Germany's scientific secrets had begun. American command rushed to secure Mittelwerk, ordering soldiers to guard the entrances and prevent looting. Teams began cataloging every rocket, every blueprint, every tool. Scientists examined gyroscopes, computing elements, and fuel systems with urgency. The deeper they ventured, the more astonishing the discoveries became. Outside, meanwhile, survivors of Dora were evacuated to field hospitals. Many were too weak to stand. Some died within hours of liberation, their bodies unable to recover from months of starvation. Others told their stories in halting voices, stories of forced labor, cruelty, and resistance. Their testimonies spread quickly among American troops, fueling anger and disbelief. The soldiers began to understand that the rockets above them, the technological marvels filling the tunnels, had been built not in triumph but in torment. And even as American scientists celebrated the acquisition of advanced technology, they could not ignore the human cost that hung over the mountain like a shadow. The V-2 had been born from genius and suffering, innovation and cruelty. It had been Germany's last gamble, an attempt to wield the future as a weapon in the present. Now that future belonged to the victors. As U.S. forces secured the remaining tunnels, they uncovered evidence of sabotage, loose bolts, misaligned wiring, fuel tanks intentionally weakened. The prisoners had fought back in the only ways they could, risking their lives to cause rocket failures that might reduce casualties in the cities targeted by the missile. Their small acts of defiance had disrupted launches, caused crashes, and perhaps saved hundreds of lives. American officers listened with solemn respect, realizing that resistance had existed even in the heart of Germany's darkest project. By mid-April, Mittelwerk was fully under Allied control. The mountain that once hummed with machinery now stood silent, its tunnels lit only by the flashlights of investigators and the occasional flickering bulb left behind. Trucks lined up at the entrances, ready to haul away documents, parts, and even whole rockets. Engineers disassembled what could be moved. Cranes lifted components onto flatbeds. And as the last American teams prepared to leave, one officer paused at the mouth of the tunnel, staring into the cold darkness. He knew history had shifted inside that mountain. He knew the world was entering a new era shaped by what had been discovered here. But he also understood that Mittelwerk represented not triumph, but tragedy, a reminder that the pursuit of power, when twisted by desperation and cruelty, could produce wonders at the cost of humanity. The mountain kept its silence, and the war moved on. April 12, 1945, 9:40 a.m., as a pale spring sun struggled to cut through drifting smoke above Nordhausen, American command vehicles rumbled toward the base of the Kohnstein mountain, their engines echoing through the valley like a slow, deliberate drumbeat marking the beginning of a new phase in the unraveling of Germany's secrets. For what had been discovered inside Mittelwerk was only the surface of a much deeper story, one that reached far beyond the tunnels, beyond the prisoners, beyond the rockets themselves. While U.S. engineers crawled through the galleries inspecting machinery and photographing every chamber, word of the underground factory spread upward through the ranks, reaching generals, intelligence officers, and eventually Washington, where officials stared at the first images in disbelief. Sleek rocket bodies stretching across cavernous stone floors, precision guidance systems decades ahead of anything America possessed, and, beneath it all, the unmistakable evidence of forced labor, the footprints of men who had died building weapons meant to strike at distant cities. In the tunnels themselves, the air had grown still. The SS had abandoned the site entirely, leaving behind crates of parts, scattered documents, and ominous red marks painted on tunnel walls, symbols indicating where demolition charges had once been wired, ready to obliterate the entire facility had the Americans been delayed by even a day. That knowledge sent a chill through the engineers who walked the galleries, imagining the unimaginable, the great mountain collapsing inward, burying its secrets, its machines, and every prisoner still trapped inside. As American specialists began sorting through racks of technical manuals, blueprints, and half-finished prototypes, arguments broke out among the Allied powers far beyond the mountain. The British demanded equal access to the technology, reminding the Americans that London had endured the terror of the V-2 strikes. The Soviets, closing in from the east with ruthless efficiency, insisted that the territory containing Mittelwerk should fall under their control according to agreed-upon occupation zones. But the Americans were already moving faster than diplomacy. Under the cover of urgency and secrecy, they began transporting the most valuable documents out of the tunnels at night, loading trucks with crates marked only with coded symbols. The race had begun not only for territory, but for the future of warfare itself. Meanwhile, the German engineers who had once overseen Mittelwerk scattered across the mountains, disguising themselves as civilians, burning incriminating documents, and debating whether to surrender or attempt escape. Some feared being executed for their role in the V-2 program. Others hoped their expertise would make them valuable to whoever captured them. One of the most prominent scientists, Wernher von Braun, had already made plans to surrender to the Americans instead of the Soviets, knowing the U.S. would value his brilliance more than they despised his wartime affiliation. His team carried boxes of documents down mountain paths, burying some beneath tree roots, hiding others in barns, and hoping they would be found by the right soldiers. They knew that the Soviets, if they seized Mittelwerk, would force them into relentless, supervised labor in Soviet missile facilities. The Americans, on the other hand, offered a future, freedom, funding, and the continuation of scientific work that, in their eyes, transcended national boundaries. Back inside the mountain, the atmosphere had shifted from shock to methodical urgency. American technicians examined each rocket, each assembly line, each component with meticulous care. They ran their hands along the surface of the sleek black fuselages, marveling at the precision and symmetry of the design. They pulled open control panels, studying the guidance system, an intricate marvel of gyroscopes, servos, and miniature computing mechanisms. Some of the devices were so advanced that they looked more like science fiction than war material. The V-2 had been capable of reaching the edge of space before screaming downward at supersonic speeds, technology that no Allied engineer had believed possible until they stood face to face with it in the cold breath of the mountain. Yet beneath the awe, something darker lingered. American soldiers could not ignore the marks on the floors where exhausted prisoners had collapsed, the crude wooden coffins stacked in a corner of a forgotten gallery, the stains on the concrete walls that told silent stories. A medical officer walking through one of the tunnels stopped abruptly when he discovered a cramped side chamber containing dozens of makeshift beds, simple planks where sick prisoners had been left to die, too weak to work and too costly to feed. He stood there for a long moment, breathing slowly, forcing himself not to turn away. These rockets, he realized, were monuments not to engineering brilliance but to human suffering. And yet, the world outside would soon race to claim them. As word spread among the liberated prisoners that the Americans had secured Mittelwerk, some returned with trembling steps to the entrances, staring into the darkness with haunted eyes. They described the deafening machinery that had once thundered there, the clang of metal on metal, the constant shouting of guards, the collapsing bodies of workers who could not endure another hour. They pointed to the machines with a mixture of fear and hatred, as if the rockets themselves were responsible for their torment. But they also wept, quietly, uncontrollably, as they saw American medics entering the mountain, bringing not threats but water, not orders but blankets, not cruelty but compassion. On April 13th, senior American officers arrived to officially take command of the site. Intelligence briefings were held in makeshift headquarters at the Dora camp, where maps of the tunnel system were spread across tables. Engineers explained technical details. Officers debated which equipment should be removed first. Outside, trucks lined up along the forest roads, engines idling, tarps ready to conceal whatever cargo they were assigned to carry. The irony weighed heavily on everyone involved. The very rockets that had been designed to terrorize the Allies would now become their prize. Meanwhile, Soviet forces surged closer. Stuka dive bombers no longer filled the skies. Instead, thunderous Soviet artillery shells rolled across the eastern horizon like a storm of iron. German civilians fled west in droves, desperate to reach American lines before the Soviets arrived. The U.S. command realized they had only days, possibly hours, before Soviet patrols reached Nordhausen. Every moment mattered, and so American teams accelerated their efforts, removing guidance units, fuel pumps, and entire rocket bodies from the mountain. They hauled out drafting tables covered in mathematical calculations. They boxed up technical diagrams. They even removed entire machine tools that had been used to mill precision components. Word of the operation reached the highest levels of U.S. command. Plans began forming for a massive extraction effort that would soon be known as Operation Paperclip, a program designed to relocate German scientists and engineers to the United States. The discoveries inside Mittelwerk were too important to abandon. The future of missiles, space exploration, and long-range warfare would be written by whoever controlled the knowledge hidden inside the mountain. And the Americans were determined that it would not be the Soviets. In the midst of this frantic activity, American investigators uncovered journals, letters, and logs detailing the conditions inside Mittelwerk and the Dora camp. They read about labor quotas enforced with brutality, about secret sabotage attempts punished with executions, about engineers who begged for more humane conditions but were overruled by officers driven by desperation and fanaticism. These documents painted a grim portrait of a program built not merely on technological ambition, but on the systematic exploitation of human lives. The officers gathered around the papers in silence. They had come for rockets, but they had found tragedy. Outside the mountain, spring winds swept over Nordhausen, carrying with them the distant rumble of artillery and the faint scent of blooming trees, a bitter contrast to the horrors being uncovered. Liberated prisoners were transported to hospitals, some barely clinging to life. They told their stories to doctors, journalists, and chaplains, describing in halting detail the nightmare beneath the mountain. One man, his hands shaking, described how he had secretly loosened screws on a rocket's fuel system, knowing that the sabotage might save lives in London. Another spoke of friends who had died within days of arrival because the labor was impossible and the food insufficient. These stories spread through the American ranks, turning shock into something colder, determination to expose the truth. By April 15th, the Americans had removed enough equipment from Mittelwerk to fill dozens of railway cars. The tunnels, once alive with mechanical chaos, now echoed with emptiness. Only a few scattered crates and forgotten tools remained. Engineers walked through the galleries one last time, inspecting every corner, ensuring nothing valuable was left behind. Outside, the sky glowed orange as distant fires from the collapsing Reich reflected across the horizon. The war was ending, but the consequences of what had been discovered here were only beginning. As the last trucks rolled out of the forest, engines growling under the weight of their secrets, one American officer paused at the entrance to the tunnel. He looked back into the silent darkness, feeling the weight of history pressing on his shoulders. What lay inside that mountain would reshape nations. It would launch a new era of scientific advancement, and a new era of fear. For the first time, he understood that the weapons built here were not meant only for this war, but for wars yet to come. And as the wind swept through the trees, carrying with it the quiet echo of distant battles, the mountain stood unchanged, silent, cold, and empty, its secrets no longer buried, but unleashed upon the world. April 18, 1945, 6:55 a.m., as a thin blanket of fog drifted across the foothills of the Harz Mountains and mingled with the smoke of distant burning towns, the first Soviet reconnaissance units crossed the eastern ridges, their boots crunching over broken branches and discarded German equipment, unaware that just days before, an operation of immense historical consequence had unfolded beneath their very feet, inside a mountain now hollowed out like a metallic tomb. By the time the Soviets arrived in Nordhausen, the Americans had already extracted most of Mittelwerk's machinery, blueprints, and rocket components, leaving behind a skeletal version of the underground empire Germany had once believed would change the course of the war. Soviet officers marched through Dora, through Mittelwerk's entrances, and through the deserted tunnels, their faces twisting in frustration as they realized that the greatest technological treasure of the collapsing Reich had slipped through their grasp. They found only scraps, broken tools, damaged machinery, a few fragments of guidance systems, and some unfinished rocket shells resting in shadowed alcoves. These remnants, though still remarkable, were insufficient to replicate the brilliance they had been hoping to seize in full. But the Soviets were not only angry, they were stunned. Even the ruins of Mittelwerk revealed a level of engineering sophistication far beyond their expectations. Some Soviet engineers ran their fingers over the smooth interior of a half-finished rocket fuselage, whispering in Russian the same question American soldiers had uttered days before. How did they build this here? Meanwhile, miles westward, American convoys sped along winding forest roads with crates of documents, crates of rocket parts, and, most importantly, crates containing the future of global warfare. Inside covered trucks, carefully padded and sealed against vibration, rested Euro assemblies, combustion engines, turbopumps, and precision-machined control units. These were not simply pieces of technology. They were seeds of a new age. Some trucks carried collection crates full of Mittelwerk's most important documents, including diagrams of trajectory calculations, fuel injection models, and the mathematical formulas that governed the V-2's supersonic flight. Intelligence officers accompanied each convoy, rifles slung across their backs, scanning the tree lines as if expecting last-minute ambushes. The war was nearly over, but nothing about these transports felt routine. Everyone understood that they were not just moving equipment, they were moving the boundaries of human capability. At the same time, in makeshift field offices across occupied Germany, American intelligence teams were interrogating German scientists who had surrendered voluntarily, men who had emerged from the shadows with stacks of documents tied with string, eager to negotiate. Some of these scientists arrived in worn civilian coats, others still in partial Wehrmacht or SS uniforms hastily stripped of insignia, all carrying the same expression of anxious anticipation. They knew the Americans sought knowledge, not retribution, and knowledge was the only currency they had left. In the dim light of abandoned schools and requisitioned town halls, the interrogations unfolded like delicate performances. Engineers explained how the turbines worked, how the guidance system kept the rocket stable, how the combustion chamber materials were chosen. The Americans listened intently, scribbling notes, exchanging glances, and occasionally stepping aside to speak in hushed tones. They were building dossiers, not just of technology, but of people they might bring to America under the yet unannounced Operation Paperclip. Back at Mittelwerk, Soviet engineers examined the tunnels from a different perspective entirely. They cared little for the moral implications of the slave labor or the suffering embedded in the concrete floors. What mattered to them was what Germany had achieved technologically. They took photographs, sketched diagrams, and removed any remaining machine tools that had not been hauled away. They noted the structure of the tunnels, the dual parallel galleries, the ventilation shafts, the rail lines that allowed the movement of massive rocket components deep underground. If the Americans had taken the rockets, the Soviets would take the factory's design. A Soviet colonel walked the entire length of Gallery A, stopping periodically to inspect blast-proof columns carved from the mountain's bedrock. He shook his head with grudging respect. Despite the horrors that had occurred here, the engineering of the facility itself was extraordinary. But admiration soon turned to fury. When a Soviet officer lifted a half-empty crate containing fuel injectors wrapped in German newspaper, he held up one of the components and muttered, "This is nothing. They took everything." From Moscow's perspective, the Americans had cheated, arriving early, acting fast, and stripping the site bare before the Soviets crossed into Thuringia. The post-war competition for Germany's technological legacy had already begun, and Mittelwerk was the first battleground. While this unfolding rivalry gathered momentum, the liberated survivors of Dora continued to receive medical treatment. Many were carried from place to place on stretchers. Others huddled around campfires built outside the abandoned barracks, wrapped in blankets, trying to understand what liberation meant after months, or years, of captivity. Some walked toward the mountain entrance and stared into the tunnels with hollow eyes, remembering the friends who had not lived to see this day. One survivor, a man with sunken cheeks and trembling hands, traced the outline of a rocket component with his fingers and whispered to an American officer, "This thing killed us, one by one." The officer nodded silently, unsure how to reconcile the man's pain with the knowledge that his own country would soon benefit from the same machine. Across the valley, as American trucks rolled westward carrying the captured technology, the officers escorting them began writing preliminary reports for headquarters. These reports were astonishing in their tone. They described the V-2 rocket not as a mere weapon but as a breakthrough that could reshape aviation, physics, engineering, and even the understanding of space itself. Some officers speculated about rockets capable of crossing continents. Others imagined projectiles that could reach the upper atmosphere. And though the horrors of Dora weighed heavily on them, the sense of scientific opportunity cast an undeniable shadow of excitement. War had brought cruelty beyond imagination, but it had also accelerated the human drive to invent. Meanwhile, German civilians living near Nordhausen emerged cautiously from their hiding places as Allied control solidified. They looked upon the ruins of their town with a mixture of grief and denial. Many claimed ignorance of Dora and Mittelwerk's existence. Others claimed they knew but were too afraid to speak. But some residents finally confessed that they had heard screams echoing from the tunnels late at night, carried by the wind down the mountain slopes. They had seen the prisoners march through the streets, gaunt and limping, guarded by SS officers. These confessions, recorded by Allied investigators, would later contribute to the historical understanding of how deeply the underground factories' operations had been intertwined with the surrounding population. Back in the U.S. headquarters in Frankfurt, senior American intelligence officers gathered around a wide oak table covered in maps of the region. Reports from Mittelwerk lay stacked in thick folders. Photographs of V2 components covered the walls. A tense silence filled the room as officers discussed what must happen next. Some argued that the technology should be immediately shipped to the United States for study. Others emphasized the need to secure the German scientists before the Soviets reached them. Operation Paperclip began to take shape not as a theoretical program but as an urgent necessity. In the coming weeks, dozens of German engineers, some reluctantly, others eagerly, would sign agreements to work for the United States, their wartime past buried in classified files. These men would go on to design rockets that would carry satellites into orbit, that would send astronauts into space, that would define the Cold War's race for dominance. And all of it traced back to the tunnels beneath the mountain. By late April, spring rains fell softly across the Harz, washing away footprints and tire tracks, cleansing the forest of the immediate scars of war. But the mountain itself remained unchanged, its dark entrances staring outward like the hollow eyes of a colossal skull. The Soviets sealed portions of the tunnels, fearing structural collapse. American engineers removed the last crates, and the local civilians kept their distance, whispering stories of what they had seen and heard. Mittelwerk, once a hive of frantic activity, stood still for the first time in years, its machines silent, its darkness undisturbed. Yet the influence of this mountain was only beginning to unfold. In London, news of the factory's discovery spread through intelligence circles, igniting debates about the future of warfare. In Washington, officials began allocating funds for advanced missile research. In Moscow, Stalin demanded that Soviet engineers replicate the V2 by any means necessary. The race for the atomic bomb was nearly over, but a new race, a race for the skies, had already begun. And it had been born not in laboratories or universities, but in a suffocating underground chamber carved into the heart of a German mountain, powered by forced labor and blind desperation. As April came to a close and the war in Europe neared its final breath, one American officer returned to Mittelwerk for a final inspection. He walked the length of the gallery, boots echoing in the hollow darkness, flashlight beam cutting through dust motes floating like ghosts in the stale air. He paused beside an abandoned rocket shell, resting one hand on the cold metal. The weight of what had transpired here lingered heavily in the silence. He whispered, almost to himself, this place will define the next century." He was right. And as he stepped out of the tunnel, emerging into the fading light of a war-torn spring evening, the mountain behind him exhaled its final breath, its secrets no longer hidden, but carried into the future by the very nations it had once been built to destroy. April 15, 1945, 6:40 p.m., as the evening fog settled across the foothills of the Harz Mountains, and the last rays of sunlight faded behind ridgelines blackened by smoke from distant artillery, the world moved one breath closer to uncovering the most secret and desperate gamble of Hitler's collapsing Reich. In the tunnels of the Mittelwerk, the ground trembled. Some believed it was another cave-in. Others thought it was dynamite charges set off by retreating guards, but the truth was far more momentous. Allied forces were approaching from every direction, converging on Nordhausen like a tightening vice, and the echoes rolling through the earth were the first distant signals that the underground empire of steel, concrete, and suffering was living its final hours. Deep inside the tunnels, prisoners paused their work for a heartbeat, hands blistered, eyes sunken, bodies skeletal, as the vibrations filtered through the air. Some dared to hope. Others feared the SS would kill them before the Allies arrived. For months they had worked under conditions no human being should endure, surrounded by the clatter of machinery, the sting of dust thick as fog, the slap of boots from overseers who ruled through terror. But on this night, something changed, subtle but unmistakable. The guards were nervous, their movements sharp, their whispers frantic, and above ground, Allied scouts pushed steadily through forests, fields, and ruined villages, unaware that beneath their boots lay a labyrinth containing the most technologically advanced weapon Germany had ever built. As American infantry advanced, they encountered sporadic resistance from SS units determined to protect Nordhausen at any cost. Roads were mined, houses rigged with explosives, and yet the defense crumbled faster than anyone expected. Germany was out of time, out of fuel, out of men, but not out of secrets. Within the dark interior of Mittelwerk, engineers who once boasted of Germany's scientific brilliance now scrambled to destroy documents, smash prototypes, and burn blueprints, but there was simply too much and too little time. Hundreds of V2 components lay stacked like the bones of unfinished monsters. Firing tables, trajectory data, assembly instructions, everything that had allowed Germany to launch thousands of rockets across the Channel was still scattered throughout the chambers. And as prisoners watched their captors panic, something hard and unfamiliar stirred within them, the realization that liberation might be closer than death. By dawn on April 16th, the 3rd Armored Division maneuvered through valleys thick with morning mist, their tanks rolling past shattered farmhouses and smoke rising from fields where retreating German forces had torched supplies. Artillery thundered in the distance. Reinforcements pushed forward. And then, as the fog thinned, American scouts found the entrance to the Dora camp. What remained of it? Survivors stumbled toward them, skeletal figures in ragged uniforms, eyes hollow but flickering with the fragile light of hope. Some collapsed at the soldiers' feet. Others tried to speak, but could not produce words. The Americans looked on in horror, realizing that the brutality they had heard rumors of was not exaggerated. It was worse, much worse. And yet the greatest shock awaited them underground. When engineers and infantry units descended into the tunnels for the first time, the experience left hardened veterans speechless. The air was thick with dust. Tracks for transporting rocket components stretched endlessly into the gloom. Cavernous chambers with ceilings towering 20 meters high held engines, fuel pumps, guidance systems, entire assembly lines built inside the earth. Electric lights flickered, casting ghostly shadows over machines still warm from recent use. The stench of sweat, oil, and death hung heavy. What struck the officers most was the scale. They had expected workshops. They found a city designed for one purpose, to manufacture weapons meant to terrorize civilian populations hundreds of miles away. Rows of unfinished V2 rockets lined the tunnel walls like metallic skeletons, their pointed noses aimed toward the darkness. Some stood nearly completed, waiting only for their fuel systems. Others lay in fragments, crates labeled with serial numbers that hinted at production goals the Reich could never hope to meet. And scattered among the machinery were the traces of the prisoners who had built them, discarded wooden clogs, torn blankets, rusted tools, scraps of paper bearing numbers or names. Evidence of lives ground away in service of a weapon that offered them nothing. No safety, no future, no mercy. American soldiers walked deeper, flashlights illuminating scenes that would remain burned into memory long after the war. Prisoners who had died during labor were still lying beside machines, their bodies left where they fell. Others had been murdered as the SS attempted to cover their crimes. The tunnels swallowed the sounds of the living and amplified the silence of the dead. It was not a factory. It was a tomb. Above ground, intelligence officers arrived swiftly. They understood immediately that the V-2 program was unlike anything the Allies had developed. The rocket's supersonic speed, its liquid fuel engines, its guidance gyros, all of it represented technological leaps years ahead of most Allied research. And so, a new urgency overtook the investigation. Not only had they found a weapon of terror, they had found the key to the future of warfare. Days later, a specialized U.S. technical team entered the tunnels under armed escort. They documented every part, every drawing, every machine. They interviewed engineers who had surrendered. They gathered prisoners who could describe production processes. The deeper they looked, the clearer the truth became. Germany had thrown everything into the V-2 program in the final years, pouring resources into a weapon they hoped would break British morale and turn the tide of the war. It hadn't worked, but it had changed the world. In the following weeks, as Germany's surrender approached, the tunnels of the Mittelwerk became a battleground of a different kind, not of rifles and grenades, but of intelligence agencies racing to seize scientists, documents, and technology. The Soviets moved quickly from the east. The Americans accelerated their efforts in the west. The British gathered whatever they could. Each nation understood that whoever controlled the V-2 technology would control the next generation of warfare, the era of rockets, missiles, and eventually spaceflight. Among the spoils were the men who had built the rockets, men whose brilliance was shadowed by the suffering they oversaw. Some surrendered willingly, seeing defeat as inevitable. Others attempted to flee or hide. A few took their own lives. And as Allied officials debated how to handle them, whether to prosecute them for their complicity or harness their expertise for national advantage, the post-war world quietly shifted toward a new kind of conflict, one driven not by armies across continents, but by silent weapons arcing through the upper atmosphere. Through all of this, the former prisoners of Mittelbau-Dora, now slowly regaining strength, watched with a mixture of disbelief and grief. They had survived the impossible. But survival did not erase the memories of what they had endured in the tunnels beneath the mountain. Many struggled to accept that the world's most advanced weapon had been born through their pain. Some feared that the technology they had been forced to assemble would cause future suffering. Others simply wanted to leave Nordhausen behind, to see open skies again, to walk on earth rather than stone, to breathe air that did not taste of dust and despair. As weeks passed and Germany finally surrendered, a quiet stillness settled over the Harz Mountains. The guns fell silent. Roads cleared of wreckage. Fields grew green again. But deep inside the mountain, the tunnels remained, vast, empty, echoing monuments to a weapon that had promised Germany salvation but delivered nothing but death. Years later, as historians dug through archives and survivors began to share their testimonies, the world learned the full story of the Mittelwerk. Not just the engineering marvels, but the human cost. Not just the rockets, but the graves beneath them. And as nations developed their own missile programs, the shadow of Nordhausen followed every launch, every test, every step into the new era of warfare. Because the V-2 had not changed the war, but it had changed the world. And the men who survived the tunnels, those who limped back into the sunlight after months or years underground, carried with them the final truth, that Germany's last desperate hope, forged in darkness beneath a mountain, had never been a weapon of victory. It had been a weapon of despair, a monument not to power, but to the cost of believing a miracle weapon could save an empire already doomed by its own brutality. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.